I'll give everyone just a minute to get on. Welcome to Consequential Women, the 10th session of the 2022 Arkansas Historical Association Conference. I'm Julienne Crawford, and I'll be the moderator today. I've been the curator at the Arkansas State Archives for 20 years. I'm excited to moderate this panel, as women's history has always been a great interest of mine, and I have served on the board of the Arkansas Women's History Institute for many years. All three of our speakers are presenting on fascinating women, which I am sure will inspire many questions. You can post your questions in either the Q&A feature or chat. If time permits, I will read the questions at the end of all three sessions. This session will be recorded and will be available on the Arkansas Historical Association's YouTube channel at a later date. At the conclusion of the session, an anonymous survey will pop up, and we'd appreciate it if you would fill it out. Now on to our speakers. I'll go ahead and just introduce each speaker before each talk. Our first speaker, Dr. John Svendsen, will present Baroness May Dugas van Pallandt, the most dangerous woman in the world. Dr. Svendsen is a bit of a jack of all trades with numerous postgraduate degrees covering a range of topics. He's a biologist, a dentist, and a periodontist, a geologist, and a historian. His historical pursuits have centered on Arkansas natural springs and 19th and 20th century health resorts. It was in this pursuit that Dr. Svendsen stumbled upon Potash Sulphur Springs Resort just outside of Hot Springs and the most dangerous woman in the world, Miss May Dugas. Now over to you, Dr. Svendsen.
Thank you. Yes, I first stumbled across the Baroness May Dugas and doing some research on the healing springs of Arkansas, specifically Potash Sulphur Springs, just south of Hot Springs, Arkansas. And I was totally amazed and perplexed at her story. It is enthralling, it is enticing, as she is herself. It is a story that takes a little girl from the fields of Illinois to around the world, eventually here to Arkansas. And along the way, she got the claim, the most dangerous woman in Arkansas. I'm going to try to bring up the PowerPoint now. I hope you're seeing that.
Looks good.
Yes. But again, thank you for having me here today at the 81st Arkansas Historical Association. Again, we're going to talk about a woman who is really driven and has gone a long way. Again, May Dugas grew up in the rural fields of Illinois, but later became one of the most dangerous women in the world through extortion, bribery, con games, and so forth. And she was able to do so because of her beauty and her ability to talk and entice men and use her own sexuality in these pursuits. Most of her training happened in the Levy district of Chicago at a time when there were no laws against prostitution or drug use. Even the Mann Act regarding white slavery hadn't been enacted yet. It was a very corrupt and notorious community. At the age of 17, she moved to Chicago and began to work at Carrie Swatson's Bordello, one of the fanciest houses of prostitution in all of Levy. They catered only to the very rich and wealthy. And it was a great neighborhood for training. Further to the north was Hickey Dinky's Hinky Dinky's Kennan's Working Man's Exchange, a saloon, a flop house, and so forth. Hinky Dinky and his collaborator, John Bathhouse Laughlin, were essentially the aldermen that shook down the entire community and profited immensely from what was going on. It was an area first. We had Madame Emma Duval's French M House, the first place that had mirrored bedrooms. We had Mickey Finn's Saloon, and everyone knows about a Mickey now because with the saloon, literally every evening, someone's drink was getting spiced. They would take the people out, rob them, and then dump them in the back alley. Again, we all know the word Mickey. We have Mushmouth Johnson's Emporium, one of the richest Black men in all of Chicago, and a very nice philanthropist when it became to taking care of the community. We have the Ed and Louis Weiss brothers, who essentially right outside the train station would get young women as they disembark and essentially drive them into these houses of disrepute. And then, despite all the vice that's going on in this neighborhood, everything from opium dens to childhood prostitution to all of these gambling houses, saloons, and bordellos, there were actually other districts within that were considered vice districts within the city of Chicago. And the level of depravity that occurred in these areas, I'm not even going to go into. But again, a great breeding ground for Miss May Dugas to learn her trade and craft. Coming in at such a young age in this bordello, she used two forms of extortion quite frequently throughout her career. One was the keepsake love extortion, and the other one was the badger game. In the keepsake love, what you do is you get a young gentleman who's wealthy to fall in love with you and become so enthralled with you, he will actually pay for your time as a prostitute not to have sex with you, that he wants to protect you and coddle you and ultimately marry you. And once these young rich men would propose, then fathers would come in and essentially buy her off and say, go away, leave my son alone. In the Badgers game that she played with primarily her brother, she would take one of these men into her room, and as they would undress, her brother would come storming into the room, claiming to be her husband or some type of policeman. And again, the one thing about infidelity and adultery, it is ripe for bribery. And so most of these men would pay an extortion in order to keep their name out of the news and certainly away from their spouse. But she is also pickpocket, insurance fraud, embezzlement, and working in panel houses where it was easy to slip in while the John was sleeping and steal their money from their wallet and so forth. Eventually in Chicago, she was paid $20,000, which in today's, with inflation would be about $500,000 to leave a young man that had fallen in love with her. She took the $20,000, goes to New York, then to Portland, and then finally to San Francisco, visiting all the bordellos and running her scams. In San Francisco, under the name Pauline Townsend, she was arrested for larceny, but was able to entice her jailer to let her loose, and then she escaped to Shanghai, China. In China, she meets George H. Potts in Hong Kong, a rich financier and the chairman of the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. And fortunately, he was married. And that was, again, a means for her to extort additional money from George H. Potts, initially $25,000, but over the course of her lifetime, in excess of $100,000. From Hong Kong, she went to Japan, and in Japan, she met a young man, John Kirkpatrick, who fell in love with her. He lavished her with gifts and followed her across the world, and then we'll eventually come to his demise. Soon thereafter, she met the Baron Rudolph Pallandt in London. There wasn't really anything special about the Baron except for he was very wealthy. His one claim to fame is he was from the Netherlands, and he won a number of cycling races. But obviously, as we can see here from the picture, he had a little bit of an advantage with new technology and access to a different kind of bicycle. But they met in 1891. He immediately fell in love. They got married in the Netherlands. And no sooner than she got married than she began to have an alliance with a young man from Prussia. And it got a little risque. And again, it was one of those things in which the parents paid her to leave him alone. But it was obvious to the Baron that he had married someone who was not in love with him, but was definitely in love with money and in the pursuit of money. He immediately tried to get a divorce. She would not allow that, but they did in 1899 sign a decree of separation in which she was offered annual support. She was able to retain her title of Baroness and was again acceptable for royal inheritance, which was important because in 1902, the Baroness of Netherlands died and left her a lot of inheritance to allow her to continue to pursue her endeavors across the world. That later that year, she did get a divorce from her husband. He was in the Summer Olympics trap shooting and then died in 1913. Although she didn't have much of a spousal relationship, from that relationship, she was able to mingle with royalty and live in some very fine homes. Certainly the castle there in the Netherlands, certainly in her lodge on the Thames, which she primarily lived there by herself and with various lovers that she took in over the years. She was also able to buy her family a home back in Menominee, Michigan, where when she would come to visit, the home was large enough that it could allow her to stay with her small entourage. Over the years, many people fell victim to her charm. It literally was, men could not keep away. She had studied psychology, she had studied business law, she knew what made men tick, and she knew how to use all of her physical and mental talents to entice men. We talked about John Kirkpatrick that she met in Hong Kong. He followed her around the world and eventually committed suicide in New York City. At the time, they found a .38 revolver in his possession, and he had taken letters that he had gotten from May Dugas and canceled checks that she had endorsed over the years. He took those letters and checks, he put them up against his heart, put the gun and shot through the papers into his heart and killed himself. But she also swindled Charles Flynn, who owned the Porcupine Gold Mine in Canada, the Mexican ambassador, William Astor, the philanthropist, Dr. Ernest Appleby, the heir of the wild fortune of St. Paul, Minnesota, John Drake, a gambler and racehorse owner, the Baron Tommy Dewar of the Scottish whiskey distillery family, Lord Power Scott Allen, the heir of the Winfield fortune, and even her confidant, Frank Shaver, the heir of the Westinghouse fortune that she had probably embezzled another $100,000 from. Eventually, her trials and tribulations and adventures took her to Arkansas. And in December of 1903, she disembarks on the train to her awaiting chauffeur and the vehicle that she had imported from Germany at a time when there weren't very many cars in Hot Springs. She immediately purchased the Potash Sulphur Springs for approximately $60,000 from E.E. Woodcock. And despite owning the resort, she never ever stayed at the resort per se, perhaps in order not to draw attention to it, but rather she stayed in the Arlington Hotel. Now, the reason she moved to Hot Springs was because on one of her transatlantic trips, she had heard from a Kentuckian horse racer that they were beginning to build a new racetrack in Hot Springs, Arkansas, and that anyone that had lodging was going to make a lot of money. And overhearing this conversation, she headed to Hot Springs, Arkansas to buy this resort so she could benefit off of all the people that would come in due to the racetrack. Now, the racetrack was not Oakland. It was the Essex racetrack. It actually predates Oakland, and there was a lot of competition early on. And in fact, when the Essex was updated and reopened in 1917, it immediately burned. And a lot of suggestion says it was the backers of the Oaklawn racetrack that contributed to its destruction. But the racetrack wasn't open very long, because in 1907, the Arkansas state legislation made racetrack gambling illegal. And so sadly, the racetrack closed, but not until she was able to profit immensely from it. Again, she was staying mostly in the Arlington Hotel, where she was running her Badger game. She would rent 2 or 3 adjoining rooms. She'd have one room for sleeping, one room for gambling, and then one room in which she would entice these young gamblers to get into situations of which they could play their Badger game. And again, a lot of young men here in Arkansas's parents had to pony up money to get May Dugas out of their life. She eventually sold Potash Sulphur Springs to Dr. Leona Fordman, literally doubling her money in addition to profiting from it while it was open and the Essex racetrack was in performance. But like everything else, she did not own the actual hotel. She sold a fraudulent title. The money for the hotel, the actual title, was held by Mr. Potts from back in Hong Kong, and with money that was taken from Mr. Drake from St. Louis. For another decade, she would continue her exploits across the globe. During World War I, she has volunteered to assist injured soldiers returning from the front. And all at once, her temperament seemed to be tempered. She adopted a child, and together they continued to make yearly trips overseas, but without the extortion, without the blackmailing, without all the illegal overtures that she made earlier in her life. On March 10th, 1937, the Baroness died in a hotel in Manhattan of breast cancer with only her personal doctor at her side, bringing an end to a story that is far more complex, far more convoluted, and far more notoriously corrupt than I was able to give in the short time I had here with you today. But I thank you for allowing me to give you some insight into the Baroness May Dugas. And later on, again, I will certainly answer any questions you may have regarding her exploits. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Svendsen, for that fascinating presentation on the Baroness. If anybody has any questions, please type them in the Q&A or in the chat box, and we'll get to them at the end of the other sessions. Our second speaker is Dr. Rebecca Howard, and she will present on finding Miss Brady. Dr. Howard is a professor of history at Lone Star College in Houston, Texas. I'm going to just wait 1 second and ask Dr. Svendsen if he could stop his video too before we start on with Dr. Howard. Thank you, and mute yourself. So Dr. Howard is professor of history at Lone Star College in Houston, Texas. She is a Northwest Arkansas native who earned her bachelor's and her master's degree at Texas A&M University. She completed her doctoral studies at the University of Arkansas. Her most recent publication is an essay in an edited collection by LSU Press about Arkansas's Union veterans after the Civil War. But today, she is talking about her other research interest, Italian in immigration to the South during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This presentation is derived from an essay that was the 2019 recipient of the Susie Pryor Award from the Arkansas Women's History Institute. And now I will turn it over to Dr. Howard. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. All right, I'm going to share my screen. All right. When it comes that way. Okay. I am so excited to get to talk about Miss Brady. So I'm going to dive into this, and please let me know if you have any questions. You can pop those into the chat and we can talk about that at the end. So the only way Bernadette Edna Brady would ever appear on the radar of most Arkansas historians would be because of her connection to Tawnytown, Arkansas, an Italian immigrant community established in 1898, and was kind of an oddity in the Ozarks. Usually the first school teacher in such a community would merit a quick search for some basic background details to drop into a footnote: age, origin, excuse me, where her parents were born. But this is when Brady first becomes pretty interesting, because there's nothing there for her sheer lack of background detail. At the very least, she should be in the 1900 Washington County, Arkansas census, as her time in Tawnytown is known to have included that year. Such a listing would have provided basic information like her month and year of birth, the state where she was born, and the same for her parents. But even an old-fashioned line-by-line journey through the microfilm of the 1900 census for all of Washington County does not yield her whereabouts. The Tawnytown sources, including the correspondent reports for the community of Tawnytown, offer scant, unsourced, and often contradictory and frustratingly vague references to her background. One entry suggests she was a, quote, young Irish Indian who had been taught by the Sisters of Mercy in Little Rock, unquote. Another said that she was a teacher from nearby Springdale. Yet another referenced that she was from St. Louis. Unfortunately, there were no sources about Brady and her relationship to Tawnytown that indicate such basics of her background as her age, place of birth, living situation after she left Tawnytown, or even her married name. Without the date and place of birth, especially, determining where to even begin looking for her origins becomes a challenge. Once searches through traditional Washington, Pulaski, and Chico County sources yielded no information, research hit a dead end. In the extant photos of Brady, she appears no older than 20 in 1900. Here she is in front of the school in Tawnytown. How did such a young, non-Italian woman end up not only connecting with this immigrant community, but traveling with it across the entire state, from Sunnyside to Tawnytown? Why did she do this? Who were her parents? Where were her parents? Where did she come from? Until records became broadly searchable, these questions could not be answered. Here is what we do know. Bernadette Edna Brady was the first school teacher in Tawnytown. She appears in two photos from the early history of the community. One was taken around 1897 in Sunnyside, Arkansas, where the residents of Tawnytown originated. We believe that she is the young woman on the left of this photograph. Another was in Tawnytown around 1900, in which she stands in front of the original one-room schoolhouse in the community with all 50 plus of her charges. After she left Tawnytown around 1905, the Tawnytown correspondent reports to the Springdale News traced Brady's life as a music teacher around the broader region, sometimes back in Sunnyside, sometimes in Oklahoma, or occasionally as a visitor from St. Louis. She seems to have been adopted by the Tawnytown community. Between 1906 and 1920, she often visited during school holidays. She is on the right with another school teacher, Josephine Pantaleone. She continued to educate in the community, returning in the summer of 1912, for example, to run a workshop for young women of the community who were teachers. There are only two sources known in Tawnytown that indicated anything about her after 1920, however. One was an article in the January 31st, 1925 issue of The Guardian, which is now published as the Arkansas Catholic magazine or newspaper, that mentioned she was now happily married in Arizona. And the other, a list of death dates for various individuals connected to Tawnytown, written in the hand of one of her former students that indicated, quote, Miss Brady had passed away on April 7th, 1937. These slim facts, however, fail to capture the exciting and interesting life Brady led. Historians rely on archives and repositories of records that are stationary, but people are often not. They're often in motion throughout their lives. And while the lifetime movements of a small portion of human beings are broadly documented for posterity, the vast majority are not. Most archives preserve tiny portions of thousands of lives. If a historian knew that something of their subject's life might have ended up in a particular archive or government records cache, then she went searching. But if not, key information about their subject may have gone undiscovered. Faced with the impossibility of putting together minute pieces of information across dozens of archives with no real way to determine in which archives to even start to look, historians have often had to accept that for some people, to be lost to history is just the way of things. Two advancements, though, have been quietly revolutionizing the process of creating historical scholarship: online search engines of archives and records, and the digitization of historical documents in their entirety. The rapid, almost instantaneous searchability of digitized records has the power to bring new stories into our understanding of the past, especially those of individuals who may have had more of their scattered history preserved than scholars previously realized. When put together, figures that may have seemed insignificant may actually have important stories to tell. Bernadette Edna Brady is the type of individual who benefits most clearly from how historical records are accessed. Her personal information is not to be found in any traditional historical source where a historian would think to look. She does not appear in the census in Arkansas, for example, in any of the counties where she was known to have lived, ever. This was insanity inducing for me. She does not show up in tax or marriage records in which it would be logical to look. It is only through digitized and broadly searchable sources that I was able to find Miss Brady. I probably owe the creator of optical character recognition technology a thank you note, at the very least, because it is only through paper records made broadly searchable that I was able to find her. She followed her brief appearance in Taneytown with a life more independent and unique than is typically expected for a woman born in Arkansas in the 1880s. She traveled, taught, and was welcomed into the heart of an immigrant community. She was critical to the success of Taneytown, teaching not just English, but how to live in this new country. She was a musical prodigy on the piano and organ, became fluent in Italian, and had lost her entire immediate family before the age of 30. She was born in Arkansas, I finally tracked it down, taught in mining communities in Oklahoma, lived in Arizona mine country during the height of labor activism, and spent her final decade on a farm in rural Illinois. Brady's life exposes the incredible opportunities that existed for women at the turn of the last century and how far an independent woman of Arkansas could go. So through cobbling together references in mostly newspapers and mostly the society pages of newspapers. So those little notes that I think if you've spent any time in a late 19th, early 20th century newspaper, you know, they've got these, you know, Miss So-and-so was in town to visit Mrs. So-and-so for a few days. Those are the places where Brady appears in records. And that was mostly how I used, or mostly what I used to track down her timeline. So this is the overview. The full version of this story, I get really excited, probably too excited, about listing out where I found her and all these different mentions. But here's the timeline that I've been able to establish. She's born December 3rd, 1883, which put her about 14 years old whenever she's teaching in Taneytown for the first time. She graduated from St. Mary's Academy in Little Rock. This was a mission of the Sisters of Mercy. In 1897, she travels with the Mercies to Sunnyside, likely to teach. Her father was married and divorced 3 or 4 times during her lifetime, and he had recently, in 1896, remarried again to a woman who had 4 other children. So that may have been the reason that Brady stayed with the Mercies instead of traveling with the family when they moved from Little Rock to St. Louis later that year. So that's also explains the St. Louis connection. her father and her stepmother also had a pretty volatile relationship, and their divorce proceedings made it into the newspaper in St. Louis in pretty dramatic fashion. So that also might be a reason why Brady was like, oh, I'm just going to stay here in Arkansas. 1898 to 1906, she is the first school teacher in Tawnytown, but she'll also travel to teach over in Oklahoma in the mining communities of Krebs and Wilburton. School terms were pretty short at this time, and so she would teach a session over there, and then she would come back to Tawnytown, and she just seems to move with the Italian community. And because she becomes bilingual, she's able to help not just in Tawnytown, but in a number of different areas. Where sources are failing me a little bit, 1907 to 1917, it's not really clear where she is. She's might be teaching in St. Louis. She's definitely spending a few years in Chico County, Arkansas. She's appointed postmistress of Reedland in Chico County in 1915, and she may have been teaching in some of the rural schools down there. 1918 to 1922, she's in Cochise County, Arizona. This is another mining region that also had a number of Italians. And then she, at some point in 1922, 1923, moves to Moline County, Illinois, and she marries a man named Anton Koch. And on April 7th, 1937, she died of cancer up there. She was a trained educator in Arkansas at a time when Arkansas was only beginning to embrace the concept of trained educators. Education in rural Arkansas at the turn of the last century was haphazard and often reflected the desires of the community more than any adherence to a system regulated at the state level. This was driven not in small part by skepticism of the utility of book learning in a state, an economy that relied heavily on agricultural practical knowledge and skill. Progressive governors, though, Donaghy and Brough, turned their scrutiny to education in Arkansas, which in the early 20th century required less than 6 months of of instruction per year and had few requirements. For teachers, they really just needed to prove to the people of the local community they were educated and not much else. But whenever teacher training became required, that's why we have Brady come back to Tawnytown in 1912 and conduct a summer training for teachers there. Her effect on the first generation of Tawnytown can be seen in other areas as well. Kate and Nisha Penalto, for example, were among the first graduates of St. Edward's School of Nursing, which is another mission of the Sisters of Mercy. Rose Bastianelli was appointed Tawnytown postmistress in 1918, but not before Brady had the same role down in Reedland. Many of the generation that she first taught, and she was roughly their age, followed her example of movement and pursuit of opportunities. The biggest question mark about Brady, though, is why did she go to Arizona? She picked a volatile place and a volatile time to land during the First World War. With so few sources available to place Brady in Arizona, none of these are in her own voice. So the exact nature of her life there is unclear. The summer she likely arrived in the Bisbee area of Arizona. The United States was not only mobilizing for war, but Bisbee was the scene of one of the most notorious events in mining and labor history, the Bisbee deportation. Over 1,000 striking copper miners, along with regular townfolk, were rounded up at gunpoint, herded into boxcars, and taken 200 miles into the desert. They were left out there, not a deportation across a national border, but a removal nonetheless. The catalyst for this event was a strike, but underlying tensions had been boiling for decades. After 1900, European immigrants, including Italians, had been arriving in Arizona mining country to upset the balance between white and Mexican workers. Labor issues were not the only point of tension. The sheriff who led the roundup also cited concerns for white women due to Mexican men who dared to test the color line. As a result of these issues, the majority of those deported, unsurprisingly, were foreign-born. Brady was 34 years old by 1917 and a bilingual white woman. Based on her previous experiences, she likely had progressive views. She certainly would have seen labor activism in Oklahoma, and with the number of Tawnytown men who worked in the coal mines, she understood the dangers of the work and the poor conditions immigrants faced. She remained in Arizona until the middle of 1923. Her life seems to have generally continued the patterns she established earlier, academic terms punctuated with visits to friends and family. She spent the summer of 1921 in Fort Worth, visiting family, likely her cousin Cora, that she had grown up with in Little Rock. In October 1921, she attended the birthday party of a 12-year-old in her Arizona community. And as a familiar feature in her life, the guest list for that event included individuals with both American and Italian surnames. In January 1923, the Arizona Republic offered the last known mention of Brady in that state, noting her return to Tombstone after spending a weekend in Phoenix. In April 1923, on the social and personal notes page of the Moline Daily Dispatch in Moline County, Illinois, Brady was listed as part of a store minstrel troupe for Fisk and Louis' store. On June 1st, 1923, Brady married Anton S. Koch of Port Byron, Illinois. How or why Brady ended up in Illinois is an even bigger mystery than why she may have gone to Arizona. There's no indication that she knew Koch prior to moving there, although it would have been quite the whirlwind courtship for them to marry after having only known each other for a few months. In Illinois, she once again made a life for herself in a new place, becoming a wife and a stepmother. Unfortunately, this period of her life was not as long as she might have hoped. Bernadette Edna Brady Koch died on April 7th, 1937, after an illness, likely cancer, that had required surgery the previous February. Her obituary noted that she had possessed, quote, unusual ability as both a player of the piano and pipe organ. She was survived by her husband and stepdaughter. Her passing was noted a few weeks later in the Springdale News. She was 53. Finding Taneytown's Miss Brady was only possible through advancements in accessing historical records and documents. Although there is much to be gained in understanding the unique life path for a woman of her generation in Arkansas, the limitations of these records are stark. Newspaper stories, notices, and government documents offer the outline of a life. They hint at motives and reasoning, but leave frustrating blanks. Glimmers of personality make it through, but are few and far between. Brady's impact on those around her is clear, from her critical role as a teacher in Taneytown to her service in mining communities in Oklahoma and Arizona, and even her time as a farm wife and active community member in Illinois. What is missing, however, is her voice, an insight into what motivated her to pursue such a varied and widely traveled life. My hope, of course, is that somewhere, somehow, her personal correspondence or a diary has made it into an archive, and someday a kind archivist will put it in a pile of items to be digitized. But until then, anyone with an interest in unique women of Arkansas must be content with what we have found of Miss Brady so far. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Howard. That was very fascinating. I will now go on to our next speaker. Our third speaker is Dr. Don C. Bragg. He will be presenting She Knew How to Sign Her Own Name, Selma Ford versus the U.S. Forest Service. Dr. Bragg is a project leader and research forester with the USDA Forest Service's Southern Research Station in Monticello, Arkansas. His interests in Arkansas history include all aspects of the natural environment of the natural state and the people and places of that environment. Now over to you, Dr. Bragg.
All right, thank you. So I did mine as a narrated PowerPoint because I was pretty convinced I was going to actually be serving a jury duty term this afternoon, which I was fortunately not having to do. So anyhow, this will play off and then I'll be ready to deal with questions after the fact. So share my screen.
Greetings, my name is Don Bragg, and I am a research forester and project leader with the USDA Forest Service's Southern Research Station. Today I would like to share a tale of how a woman, Selma Ford, engaged the U.S. Forest Service for nearly 2 years in their efforts to acquire her property to expand the Irons Fork Experimental Forest in Polk County, Arkansas. Last year, I spoke on a short history of the Irons Fork Experimental Forest, a research location of the Forest Service's Southern Forest Experiment Station, located in the Ouachita National Forest in western Arkansas. Nestled into the upper drainage of the Irons Fork between Mena and Odin, the Irons Fork Experimental Forest was intended to be a research location to study the influence of forests and forest management on water. By the early 1940s, the Forest Service had invested considerable resources to build much of the experimental infrastructure at Irons Fork, such as this large concrete weir. The vast majority of the land incorporated into the Irons Fork Experimental Forest were properties withdrawn from the public domain when the Arkansas National Forest was proclaimed in December of 1907. Additional parcels were later added through other mechanisms such as purchase, donation, or exchange. The red circled area in this map, which dates to 1909, is the approximate location of the experimental forest, with the colored areas representing national forest lands within the proclamation area indicated by the dark bold line. Unshaded areas are privately held lands. This 1938 map of the Irons Fork Experimental Forest shows that virtually all of the nearly 9,000-acre property had come under federal control. The green shaded areas were recently acquired parcels, with a notable exception of a 100-acre parcel located just north of the Experimental Forest administrative site. This parcel was then owned by Selma Dora Ford, daughter of German immigrants Frederick and Dora Bohler, who came to the U.S. in 1883. Frederick was a shoemaker and farmer who died in 1933. I have little information on her mother Dora. Selma was born in Missouri in 1891, and the Bohler family moved to Arkansas at some point before World War I. By the Great War, Selma had married a farmer named Ernest Jones, who had been excused from the draft because he was, as the draft board put it, a cripple. In January of 1922, Ernest received a patent for this 100-acre parcel. Since this land had not become part of the Arkansas National Forest in 1907, it probably had been deemed as sufficiently farmable at that time to be excluded from reservation, or perhaps it was already occupied by someone. At this point, the paper trail gets rather weird. But first, a little background material as to why this particular parcel and Selma mattered to the Forest Service. So the experimental forest development starts in 1936. And by late 1939 or early 1940, the staff realized that they did not have sufficient space at the administrative site to develop it the way they wanted. This location had been chosen as the best site for the headquarters, in part because of its relative convenience to Mena and access via the Odin Irons Fork Truck Road. This parcel had been acquired from the previous landowner, Mason Oldham, probably for about $6 per acre. As you can see from these images, by July of 1940, the administrative site had had multiple buildings and other infrastructure built on it, and a planned caretaker's residence would not fit on the current site. These maps show the Forest Service's planned expansion and location of this caretaker's residence, which was to be placed in a triangular-shaped parcel of land then owned by Selma. This arrangement probably wasn't really the first plan of the Forest Service, however. The next series of slides will be text-driven, and I am sorry for that, and relate to an extensive but incomplete collection of correspondence between various Forest Service staffers. Many of these are written by or were sent to Norman Hawes, who was the Southern Station's local research leader or branch head. In this particular letter, Hawes was writing then Ouachita National Forest Supervisor Nelson about the urgent need to acquire Selma's property to expand the Irons Fork headquarters site by 10 acres, and how the region's landsman was willing to spend up to $25 per acre to do so. That was a lot of money for this part of the world at that time. You may have noticed in the previous slide that Selma was referred to as Mrs. Bohler, not Ford. This was part of the weirdness around this land deal. For a while, the Forest Service didn't seem to know the name of the person who they were dealing with. This memo provides some clarity as to the name confusion, as well as the complicated land transactions that had occurred earlier. When Selma was married to Ernest Jones, they had transferred their 100-acre parcel to her father, Frederick Bohler, in 1927. 3 years later, the property records show that Selma's father transferred the 100 acres back to Selma, who had apparently divorced Jones and married a man by the name of Henry Shaw. Why these land transfers occurred is unclear, but Selma divorced Shaw in 1933 and apparently went back to her maiden name of Bohler through at least mid-1940. Clear as mud yet? Well, it wasn't for the Forest Service. To cover the possible contingencies, Hawes was given a list of several ways to address this possible land transfer using the appropriate titles for Selma. It is also important to note that by the time of this letter, the land price had been settled at $23 per acre for the 10 acres, or $230. This price was high enough that it concerned Forest Supervisor Nelson, who noted that the agency's appraisal of the land was much lower, only $5.17 per acre, which would have included both land and timber. Paying such a premium over the assessed value of the land would be possible for the agency if the reason was deemed sufficient. Nelson would later write to the Southern Station's director that this price was much more than assessed, and the station would need to justify the extra cost based on need. The region, who would be handling the land sale transaction, also apparently did not have the funds on hand to make the purchase, and therefore the sale may need to wait until 1942 because they had already committed all their planned land purchase monies for 1941. While the station would have no problem in writing a justification for the higher sale price, there was considerable concern that they may need to wait until 1942 to buy the land from Selma. There was a very specific reason for this concern. Hawes had secured only a one-year option to buy the 10 acres of land for $230 on July 16th, which meant that by 1942, Selma would not need to sell at that agreed price, if at all. Note that by the signing of this option, she was now Selma Ford, having apparently married Seaborn Ford within the past few weeks. Hawes quickly produced a required justification letter to the Ouachita Forest Supervisor. His letter also points out Selma's reluctance to sell the 10 acres and suggested she may want to start farming that part of the land again, perhaps to add pressure to the agency to approve the sale. A separate memo from Hawes to his supervisor, Mac McGinnis, begged for more pressure to be applied to agency brass to get the sale completed. Hawes' pleas had little effect on agency leadership. Indeed, by mid-September, the regional office based in Atlanta added to the crisis by insisting that Hawes go back to Selma and try to get her to sell the entire 100-acre parcel, not just 10, and at a much lower price. Dutifully, Hawes went back to Selma to check and was immediately rebuffed. In a great quote from his response to Nelson, Hawes wrote, "She lives very close to the soil, has few needs, and with a garden and a few cattle and goats, is able to subsist with no apparent outside help. Furthermore, she likes the relative seclusion of her place far from neighbors. The freedom she enjoys and the sense of security obtained by ownership of land she helped to homestead with one of her late husbands is apparently of greater value to her than the few dollars per acre which she feels would be all the government would be willing to offer her. Since the experimental forest had little need for the other 90 acres, Hawes did not want to pursue that land any further." In October, the Washington office insisted that Hawes go back to Selma again and try to get the whole 100 acres again. That office was willing to pay more than suggested back in September for the 100 acres, up to $10 per acre, which they believed was more than fair. After all, the records of recent acquisitions in the area, likely including the land bought from Mason Oldham that holds the rest of the administrative site, were bought for less than $7 an acre. The Forest Service also offered her to let her live in her home and tend her animals on the property until she decided to move or had died. By the end of October, Hawes responded back to the agency that after several more attempts to get the whole 100 acres, Selma hadn't changed her mind and did not want to give up any of her property rights or freedom just to stay on land she would no longer own. Frustrated, Hawes suggests that in a few years, Selma would probably want to sell out the rest of the land, so why not just get the 10 acres now and try again then? By the end of November 1940, it would have appeared that Selma's resistance paid off, and the Forest Service dropped their efforts to secure the whole 100 acres. Selma's enjoyment of her secluded backwoods life on the remainder of her parcel without submitting to the lifetime reservation option was accepted, and the proposed purchase was sent on for further processing. This process remained challenging, however. Once the chief of the Forest Service approved, the case was forwarded on to the National Forest Reservation Commission for evaluation and approval. As 1941 crept along, Reports from Washington made it clear that the purchase of 10 acres of Arkansas backcountry was not as high a priority as other issues of the time, including growing efforts related to the war in Europe. By March of 1941, efforts were being made to get it on the docket for consideration at the Commission's next meeting, whenever that was to be scheduled. Hawes was anxious, of course, because their one-year option to purchase the property was rapidly approaching. And the Forest Service made it in the nick of time. A July 15, 1941 letter to Selma from the Ouachita National Forest Supervisor reported the federal government's agreement to purchase. Selma was instructed to sign the deed with her husband to finalize the transfer. Rather condescendingly, though, a note at the bottom of the letter also advised Hawes to contact Selma and assist her in completing the process, suggesting she may not know enough to get it done. It is hard to say how this apparent slight might have gone over with Selma. When Hawes contacted her a couple weeks later, she dismissed his offer to help her complete it. She knew how to sign her own name. And then she told Hawes that she had yet to make up her own mind about selling the Forest Service those 10 acres for $230. Hawes implored Forest Supervisor Bryan to send some of his staff to move the process along, probably to help show that the government was serious about this sale. By late August of 1941, Selma had rewarmed to the idea of selling those 10 acres, and by early September, the Forest Service finally had deed in hand signed by both Selma and Seaborn. These letters, and the ones previous to them, make it clear how Selma was always the party in control of the land sale, not her husband's or the agency or anyone else. By mid-September, Selma had signed the final agreement with the Forest Service that allowed her to access parts of her land that she could not otherwise access without crossing the newly sold property, which the Forest Service had planned to fence and gate off to restrict access control to the general public. On October 13, 1941, after nearly 2 years of documented effort, Norman Hawes signed the final Forest Service form acknowledging that the agency had taken legal possession of the 10-acre parcel, which allowed the Forest Service to begin the next phase of development of the administrative site of the Irons Fork Experimental Forest. Of course, circumstances said otherwise. Within 2 months, the Japanese had bombed the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, and plunged the nation into World War II. The federal government immediately shifted all available staff in all agencies towards work related to the war effort, and that included even the small staff at remote field stations such as the Irons Fork. Once the Southern Forest Experiment Station had redirected the work of the staff and Hawes was commissioned into the Navy, by early 1943 they would never again station people at Irons Fork. Now, this old home site is not Selma's. It is just an example of the nature of these early settler homes in this part of the state. Other challenges aside, it is important to recognize Selma Ford and her interactions with a major federal agency. For the better part of 2 years, Selma leveraged her opportunities and took advantage of her circumstances to do far better for herself than may have otherwise been expected. Her humble parcel of land may have held little significance for bureaucrats in Washington, D.C., but it seems to have meant the world to Selma, and nearly as much to Norman Hawes. Selma showed incredible agency in the face of the federal government in her desire to retain her personal independence and self-determination. Although disdained and dismissed by many Forest Service staffers, her resilience and persistence got her a much better deal in her own terms than many of her neighbors had. While her other property eventually became part of the National Forest, it is clear to me that Selma Ford clearly was a consequential woman. Thank you for your attention.
Dr. Bragg, that was very interesting. I am going to go on. I think we have a few minutes, so we can go through a few questions here. Let's see. Rachel Patton was asking Dr. Howard a question. Where in Arkansas was Miss Brady born?
So she was born in Little Rock. And I'll also kind of tie that to Darren's question as well. So I found that information on her death certificate from Illinois. And so that was the weirdest thing that I found, because at first I didn't think it could be her. It popped up because someone had attached it to a family tree that they'd created. It looks like it was like the great niece of her husband. And I'm like, this can't be the right woman. Why would she have been in Illinois? And then but it was that death certificate, because it has so much information. It listed her birth date, and the death date matched exactly the date of death that we had on that handwritten list. And so that's how she got, once I tracked that down, then I had to start looking in Illinois, and I had no reason to think that she was there. So that was kind of the most shocking or oddest thing, but it really led me to flesh out her story a bit more.
And then I think Dr. David Ware had also mentioned something about Bisbee during the period was a rough and scary place. And Cochise County Sheriff Harry Wheeler was a real piece of work, who also was a stickler for enforcing the state's dry law, primarily targeting ethnic minority minors. One wonders what Miss Brady made of what was going on around her.
I think she knew exactly what she was getting into. So she had worked in those mining communities in Oklahoma that had some labor unrest. Taneytown had been fighting against prohibition and sheriffs targeting them. The state legislature went after Taneytown and tried to shut down their wine industry in 1907. So she arrived right after, as best I can tell, right after the deportation. And there's no way she went into that blind, or I think even naive. She's in her late 30s. She's been around and experienced what immigrant communities have to deal with. So I think she knew exactly what she was doing. We don't have anything in her voice to really emphasize that, right? Or to verify that. But based on her history, I don't think there's any way that she misunderstood what she was getting into heading out there.
Okay, and Dr. Bragg, Dr. Svendsen had a question. He was curious if there were any of the original improvements, weirs and water divisions that are still in place and functional. He did later see that many of the such structures still evident in your site survey of the Iron Fork experiment for us. I wasn't sure if there was anything else you might want to mention.
Yeah, so there are definitely still remains of those. That big concrete weir I showed the picture of originally, that's pretty much intact. It's big, heavy concrete. It didn't really get blown away. Some of the smaller stone and concrete ones have been kind of eroded out, but you can still find evidence of those there. None of them are functional as how they were designed to operate. The equipment has not been maintained on them. Some of it actually has been removed, was removed years ago. But the evidence is out there for most of that infrastructure.
And we have one more question for you from Dr. Ware. How long did Selma Ford remain on her land after this episode? And when was her tract incorporated into the Ouachita Forest?
Well, so I'd have to look into that to dig. I didn't try to track down the fate of the rest of the parcel post the original transaction. It all does become part of the Ouachita National Forest at some point. Selma stays in the area. I believe she remarried at least one more time. She was fairly popular, I guess. She just got married a bunch of times, got divorced a bunch of times. And so some of that could have affected some of the property ownership and transactions. Good thing with federal agencies is we're really good about documenting a lot of that stuff. I would imagine it shouldn't be that impossible to dig that out. It's not like trying to find some of these records that challenges some of the world. It's just a matter of digging into some of the title records, and that would be able to find. My guess would be it was after World War II, probably in the 50s or 60s.
Great. And Dr. Svendsen, I think we had a few questions for you. I think some of them were answered in the chat. But one person did ask how old the Baroness was when she first ended up in a brothel. I'm not sure if you're still with us or not.
The Baroness went into prostitution when she was 17. She married the Baron when she was 23. Most of her exploits were in her 20s and 30s. Of course, I guess she was in her late 40s when she died. I think hopefully that answers the question.
And Mark Chris had asked about any books out there on the Baroness.
There is one book. It's one of those fictionalized historical accounts. It's called The Parlor Games. I would not, it's great reading as a fictionalized account, but not very factually accurate.
And I guess over the years, the Potash Sulphur Springs Resort had changed names. Is that correct?
Potash Sulphur Springs has gone through a very significant change. It was eventually sold. Well, it wasn't really sold. It went into that kind of fraudulent title. That took a number of years to settle out as different investor groups tried to purchase in. Ultimately, it was bought by the Wilson family that ran it for another 20 or 30 years as a more as a cottage type resort. And then ultimately it was sold and used sold to Union Carbide, and now is one big open pit mine for vanadium and titanium and other rare minerals.
Well, thank you. Thank all of our speakers here. It was very, very interesting, all of your presentations. I do encourage all of you, as you are leaving, a pop-up should come up to do an anonymous survey, and we would appreciate it if you could fill that out. Thank you to everyone.